Welcome to this concurrent panel, Overcoming Restrictive Zoning Solutions for Ownership and Rental Housing. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists for this afternoon. Joining us are Tony Irwin, President and CEO of the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, Louis Morente, the Legislative Director at California YIMBY, Eric Lombardi from More Neighbors Toronto, and Namablander, Architect and Urban Planner with Smart Density. I'm going to ask all of our panelists to give some brief opening remarks, and then we will proceed to the discussion section of our panel. As always, if you've got questions, please submit them through Whova, and we will pose them to our panelists as we can. This session will go until 2:20, at which point we will wrap it up with Richard Lyle's closing remarks. With that, Tony, why don't you start us off?
John Michael, thank you so much. It's a pleasure joining and being with all my co-panelists today. Look forward to an interesting and enlightening conversation. So a little bit about FRPO and the organization that I represent and work with. At FRPO, we focus on government relations and advocacy. It's a major part of what we do to ensure there's a positive environment for our members. What does that mean specifically? Preserving a favorable climate for existing purpose-built rental so that the operating environment does not become a deterrent to those who operate and manage rental housing, and creating conditions that incent the creation of new purpose-built rental housing. You could say we spend half of our time trying to prevent bad things from happening and half our time trying to make good things happen, to make investment in maintaining and building new purpose-built rental a viable option for operators and investors. Why? Because Ontario needs purpose-built rental housing and a lot more of it. So let me first tell you about our priorities in terms of preserving the existing system. The industry has learned to work within the bounds of the rent control system since it was first created in 1980. But there are three key provisions of the system that we need to maintain. First, the exemption from rent control for new construction to help ensure new units are built. This has been a policy of successive governments going back to Bob Rae. It was removed by the Liberals in 2017 and restored by the current government in 2018. It's a very important condition that should be maintained for getting new housing supply built. Secondly, vacancy decontrol. The hard reality of rent control is that rents don't keep pace with the cost of operating. Over time, this leads to structural decay of the stock. Vacancy decontrol allows for units to reset to market rents when they become vacant, allowing catch-up investment and preventing the unit from falling into a long-term cycle of underinvestment and decline in state of good repair. Today, this policy is under threat from the NDP, but it's absolutely crucial that it be maintained. And finally, above guideline increases. What vacancy decontrol does for suites, above guideline increases does for critical building infrastructure, boilers, roofs, elevators. AGIs allow for permissible capital projects to be funded with increases that are above the annual guideline. Together, these three systems allow Ontario to protect sitting tenants from extraordinary rent increases without experiencing the inevitable decline in the condition of rental housing stock. It's very important to today's topic because no incentive to get new buildings in the ground can overcome the damage that is done to investor confidence when governments fiddle with the basic economics of operating a building over time. So to get new housing built, policymakers have to be responsible in how we manage what we already have. Next, let's turn to incentives for creating new stock. We were pleased to participate with the Housing Task Force and are very supportive of their recommendations. There's a few key priorities for FRPO and our members. One is creating as-of-right zoning framework for purpose-built rental. This would provide zoning certainty based on meeting a set of conditions agreed upon by the province and the municipal sector. For example, zoning approval for additional density on existing rental housing property could be automatically available if there is sufficient land area to floor plate ratio, servicing, parking, etc. This policy-led zoning certainty could save years in the process and unlock thousands of units. Second, creating density incentive for rental projects. This will improve project economics. We've heard a lot about that throughout the day, and help rental compete with more favorable business cases for non-rental developments. It could be piloted in partnership with a willing municipality, and if successful, linked to future updates to as-of-right frameworks. Third, create a provincial triage service led by a rental housing facilitator to cut red tape. We've all heard lots about how much red tape impedes in the system and getting projects approved and getting them built. This could certainly cut years off timelines to get projects completed. Fourth, create provincially funded financial incentives for mid-market rental housing projects. We've also heard a little bit about that throughout the course of today. Too often, project pro formas just don't work for rental because of all the factors: land, construction, fees and charges, limits on density. So this is something that governments could work on, could reduce the burdens of fees and charges, which now include development charges, parkland contributions, community benefits charges. This could take many forms and something that should be explored. And then finally, a couple of other tools that we know work. Income supports to help people to pay their rent. We know portable shelter allowances work and rent supplements work. And then finally, training for trades. We know there's a huge shortage of labor, skilled labor and trades, and that does delay projects and that delays housing from being built. This is something I think we all agree on and we all need to tackle. And with that, John Michael, thank you very much for the introductory comments.
Thank you, Tony. Louis, why don't you go next?
Sure. My name is Louis Morente. I'm the Legislative Director for California YIMBY. California YIMBY is a California-focused nonprofit that really focuses on the state capital here in California and tries to tackle all the elements of California's immense housing crisis. Our main focus is production. We normally focus on things like zoning reform, on streamlining the construction of housing, and on reducing the fees associated with building housing. But as Legislative Director for California YIMBY, I've worked on a wide variety of laws, including tenant protections and funding for subsidized affordable housing. I'm proud to say that as Legislative Director for California YIMBY has helped pass really large changes to California's accessory dwelling unit law, which is now creating more than 20,000 homes a year. We've helped end discrimination against tenants in various forms, including in HOAs. And we've helped streamline the production of housing by limiting the number of hearings and the number of types of review that housing in California can go through. So I'm excited to talk about ways in which California's lessons tackling production can inform other strategies in other parts of the world.
Louis, thank you so much. Eric, why don't you go next?
Hi, my name is Eric Lombardi, and I'm a volunteer and advocate with More Neighbors Toronto. We're an advocacy group, a non-revenue advocacy group founded last year in July, which is when we launched. And we believe that we absolutely need to end the housing crisis here in Ontario. We advocate for policies and solutions to bring an end to the housing crisis, both at the provincial level here in Ontario and at the municipal level, specifically here in Toronto. We recognize that there are complex issues within housing, and therefore the solutions to the housing crisis are also multifaceted. Firstly, we do believe that supply side reforms are absolutely critical to making the rest of the market work. That means building more homes, but also more specifically, building more homes in the places where there's demand for them, which means more infill types of housing and other environmentally sustainable forms of growth. The second thing is we need the government to be more active in the creation of both rental housing by changing incentives, but also designated affordable housing, deeply affordable housing, and even potentially social housing. And finally, we do believe that there are demand side factors that are making this crisis even worse. And that's why we do believe that there are demand side solutions, such as taxing land and other forms of speculation taxes that could all help to lower prices in the long term. Because if we don't, we're looking at a more neo-feudal future where if you do not inherit land, you're totally locked out regardless of what your incomes are, as we're seeing in Toronto, where it now requires an income of over $300,000 to get a home. That's not sustainable, and it's time for change, and that's what we're advocating.
Eric, thank you so much. Finally, Nama, please let people know what you're about.
Thank you. I think my introduction is going to be a little bit less formal, but thank you for having me. I'm Namablander. I'm an architect and urban planner with Smart Density. I'm looking here at a very long list of in our audience, so I encourage everyone to connect with me on LinkedIn. This is where I'm very active. So Smart Density is an architecture and urban planning firm, and we marry these two perspectives in everything we do, and we found it to be our secret sauce compared to any other firm. We are very well known for our missing middle project, and I believe that's the reason I'm here, and we're going to talk a lot about it. But essentially the vast majority of Toronto is designated neighborhoods, which has the most restrictive zoning of all. And the missing middle speaks exactly to that, that currently in Toronto, you look left, everything is single family houses, you look right, hyper density, and nothing in between. And I'm kind of describing it for our colleague here from California. So one project that we are bringing creative solutions for, so I'll just give you an example, and I encourage you to Google it, is the Minimitries concept that is an award-winning concept that we came up with, which is basically how to utilize the mid-rise building design guidelines the City of Toronto initiated 11 years ago, and yet we don't see enough mid-rise buildings as they should be. And one of the challenges is really how long it takes to assemble several properties to have a mid-rise building. So we basically said, why not having a mid-rise building on a single property? So Google it, it has a very provocative image that got a lot of public attention lately. So this is us, and thank you for having us.
Pardon me, of course, I was the one to leave myself muted. Thank you all to our panelists. Louis, I guess I wanted to start with you in terms of the California context, because Ontario is probably moving to have a major piece of housing legislation coming probably only weeks from now. And why did California YIMBY move, as my understanding of the history of it is, move from why did the advocacy move from local fights at the municipal level to the statewide advocacy?
Great question. So I'm excited to read more about that legislation, potentially hear more about it today. That's very cool. I wish you the best of luck. But to your question, the reason we really shifted our focus from local governments to the state government is that California, well, the United States has a very, I'm not as familiar with the Canadian context, but has a very, I don't know what the robust federalism structure whereby local governments state governments can preempt local governments on almost every issue and matter of law. Our focus was, originally on the places where YIMBYs lived, places like Oakland or San Francisco or whatever, right? And on the housing policies there. But as we quickly realized that most of the problem in California really was the exclusion that suburbs were creating through their low density zoning laws and their really restrictive processes for approving housing, we realized we sort of, to borrow a phrase popular in culture now, we needed to speak to the manager. We really had to focus on the state legislature and get them to realize the collective benefit to California in arresting some of the things that local governments were doing here. And that's been a very successful model. That really has, I think, produced a substantial amount of housing, especially in the missing middle space, especially in accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, as I'll call them. It's also a little bit different here in the sense that, well, I'm sorry, it's probably similar here in the sense that local politicians are very responsive to their most active neighborhood groups. They're often elected in off-year elections. They're very low turnout elections. So if you have a local neighborhood NIMBY group, you can really sway local politics in a very powerful way. That's something we've especially learned from Los Angeles. State races are different. California state senator is the second least democratic member of any elected body in the United States, other than the United States Senate. A California state senator represents almost 1 million people, and the assembly members here represent about half that. And they have to take a much more regional focus in their elections and in their policymaking than local governments do. I'll just, on my final point, say that California and the United States in general has a very long history, especially in the 1950s and 60s, of incorporating communities for the often explicit purpose of accelerating racial segregation and to accomplish goals generally associated with racial animus. And many of those communities have not changed the rules that they put on the books since 1950 and 60, and really have no intention of doing so. That's one of the reasons we have so many local governments. California, though it has 40 million people, has almost 500 local governments that do some form of oversight of local housing functions. That's frankly just way too many local governments to coordinate successfully. And it's much easier, I think, to convince the legislature that housing is important, because there you're talking with 120 members, versus convincing 500 local governments that housing is important, especially when they have the politics they do with off-year elections and neighborhood associations. So I'll just stop there and say we've had some success in talking to the legislature, and I think that's been the right move.
I think here in Ontario, we probably have a higher ratio of municipalities per capita. So some mayors and councillors might have just, their ears might have started burning when you said that, but we will see. Nama, I wanted to ask you, this is a question from the audience, and I want to put it to you as a practitioner of this stuff. There were a number of recommendations in the recent Housing Task Force report that the province published about overcoming restrictive zoning. Are there specific suggestions from that report that you think should be given priority, or that would most make your job easier?
The entire report. The report was excellent. Definitely taking the right direction, the right steps. And the thing is, it was done by professionals saying things we all know in the industry for years. Okay, we know that. That wasn't the problem. Knowing that, figuring it out, there's almost a consensus around it. The problem is that this is an election year, and I want to see how and which of our leaders are going to, address this report, embrace this report, and I think the challenge is a political challenge, not at all a professional one. So if you're asking me to choose one from the list, I can choose one, but it doesn't matter. That's not the interesting part of the report. The interesting part is, asking our leaders, are they bold enough to adopt this report and implement it?
As somebody who wrote a piece for TVO saying, I think the headline was like, is Doug Ford brave enough to do this? I agree. Tony, I do want to ask, Lewis laid out some of California YIMBY's priorities, and at the risk of maybe putting words in his mouth, he didn't seem to think that there was a conflict between tenant protections and being, pro-supply, getting more homes built. And I'm wondering if you wanted to comment on that. Do you see a conflict there, or can we perhaps all learn to live with each other?
Well, it's a very important question and a good point you raise. I mean, I don't think there's a contradiction there. I mean, we're very supportive of and think tenant protections are extremely important. I think we all do. But I think over the last few years, we certainly have seen, and Eric, I think probably would agree with this. I mean, and you would too, I think, John Michael. I mean, when I arrived in this role 3.5 years ago, I still was in many conversations with whether they were, ministry officials or elected officials or otherwise, trying to sort of convince them that we did have a supply problem, that we needed more housing. People would not sort of be accepting of that necessarily and think, well, no, it's all just demand side, or it's, we don't really know if that's true, or where's the data coming from, or how do you know that? It seems to me now that, and certainly the task force report seems to make it very clear. And I think now there does seem to be, with all political leaders, a real consensus that we do need more supply. And that doesn't have to come at the expense of tenant protections. I think we can certainly find a way to make all that work together. I mean, Eric can talk a lot about, obviously, and I hear it too in my role, the community meetings and those who don't want anything to change ever, and all of that. And I think we really do need to try to move past that in a way that says, for example, we talk about unicorn sites within FERPO, and that's an idea we've talked about went back to right before the pandemic, where we said there are a lot of sites in the province, and Urban Nation helped us identify close to 1,000 that have existing towers on them. There's enough land because they were built in a time when land was abundant, and you can put more towers on those sites. and we should be encouraging that. But of course, there are all kinds of obstacles, as we well know, that prevent that from happening. But that's not, I don't think there's a contradiction. I agree with Lewis, and I think we believe very much that it's important that tenants be protected, but we need places to live, and we need many more places to live. And I think we can make those things work together. I don't think they are, I don't think one has to be sacrificed for the other.
Eric, we have a question from the audience, and I think it's because you said the magic word of land value taxing. The question from the audience is, taxation seldom dissuades investment. How would taxing land purchase be any different?
It's not about dissuading investment. It's about encouraging the incentives to make the land used effectively. So whenever you tax anything, it tries to get minimized, right? But land isn't something you can really minimize. It's just there. And so when you tax land, which is more expensive based on the value of what else is proximate to that land, you encourage that land to be utilized to its most productive purpose relative to the tax that you've placed on it. And so if you switch something from being a property tax, which is land plus built form, to just, for example, being land, it'll be a lot more biting when those who have that land aren't utilizing it effectively to generate the returns to pay the tax. So, ultimately, that's what it does.
I'd love to stick with you for just a moment, Eric, because I think More Neighbors Toronto has been a really interesting development, for lack of a better word, in Toronto politics. The group has been very active and has started to push the needle, I think, at the risk of editorializing there. And I'm just curious, where was the impetus for this briefly? If you could, what made you decide like this was how you were going to spend your free time?
Yeah, so I actually got into the YIMBY movement when I lived in San Francisco, and actually watching groups like California YIMBY sort of start to challenge the narrative at the local level, especially in San Francisco, which mentioned earlier that doesn't really know what politics is like in Toronto, and very much it is actually very much the same. So the province does have basically total power over the municipalities, but it's very difficult to exercise that for political reasons, and there's much less political participation municipally, which creates all these bad incentives. And as I moved back to Toronto, this issue being so not just important to people who are in my generation, and many of my friends who are locked out of basically having the futures that they were told that they would get if they worked hard and got good educations and got good jobs, and suddenly you still can't live here, right? You look at all of that and how our leaders are so unable to grapple with the politics of this challenge because they're afraid of upsetting the status quo, even though across the industry and advocacy and nonprofits, we all sort of see the accumulation of these interest groups who are comfortable and they just say no and not here, and I don't want my change, I got mine, and are benefiting from the increasing prices of housing and saying no, like this actually is bad for our culture and is going to destroy us. And the way More Neighbors really came to be was the realization that there's a lot of energy, especially among young people, about fixing this problem from a regulatory and legal point of view, and not really any tremendous coordination of efforts of those who are angry about the issue. And so taking a fig leaf from the Neighbors for More Neighbors movement in Minneapolis, which I think did an excellent job at framing the conversation about housing as not being exclusive or discriminatory towards new people, and really focusing it on growth will make our communities better. Like things will become more walkable, we'll have stronger local businesses, or like really changing that conversation, and then organizing everyone who has passion about this issue to just show up and write to leaders, like, can we put policy documents that will get attention together, right? And that's really what I think we're seeing as a positive force. And I'd even say we're also seeing a lot more opportunities provincially for change than locally here in Toronto, because Toronto can barely even get like the basics done on its own. We couldn't get multi-tenant housing done. Municipalities just won't get it done. You know, the mayors of Oakville who serve the rich members of Southeast Oakville are gaslighting on this report. They're not going to get it done because they don't care. And so we need the province that can take a broader scope, actually do something about it.
Eric, thank you. Louis, we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to preface this by saying I don't know if it's possible to give a bullet point summary of some of the California YIMBY's recent successes, but this question is, what are some top policies on California YIMBY's wish list that they would like to see the legislature adopt? So I don't know if you're able to talk about some of the successes you've already had, but as well, you know, what's next on the to-do list?
Sure. Happy to get into that, but I want to bring up something that both Eric and Nama have said at this point, because I think it's such an important point, that the housing crisis in the industrialized world that California is experiencing, that Toronto is experiencing, that many municipalities are experiencing, is one that's a function of policy choice rather than engineering know-how. Our leaders every day choose the housing crisis for us, and that is a bad choice they should be criticized for. They can make different choices. Our leaders here in California have started to make different choices. As Eric mentioned, Minneapolis made a different choice, and I really do hope that the leaders in Ontario make a different choice as well. It really is a situation where we all need to come together as a housing movement and convince folks that we are the stronger political bloc, that votes really are going, that our votes are really going to depend on our leaders' responsiveness to housing as a concern. So I just want to, I want to highlight that point before I get into that question. This year, well, I suppose just to start off with what California YIMBY's accomplished most recently, we were the sponsors of a bill called AB 68, which allowed an accessory dwelling unit on every lot in California. I would argue, although people argue with me, effectively ending single family zoning here in California in 2019. In 2021, we were the main supporters again of a bill called SB 9, which allowed a project proponent to split a lot and build 2 homes on each of those lots for a total of 4 in most single family areas in the state, creating opportunities for home ownership, I'll add, because ADUs are going to be for rent only. We've also been the main proponents for successful attempts at fee reform here in California. California has ludicrously high fees because of a very strange property tax rule that we have in our constitution. And we have a really onerous process for getting housing approved. So, you know, another big victory has been a process bill called SB 330, which limits the number of hearings a housing project can go through to 5 and caps the rules, says, hey, local governments, you cannot change rules about how to build housing once somebody has submitted a project. So you can't change the rules midstream on a housing project, which had been happening all the time. Really common sense reforms, really important reforms. I think California YIMBY and the YIMBY movement in California is really just getting started. I do want to say, and some of this is just self-flagellation, but I do think this is a really important point. The California YIMBY as an organization is unique in that it regards its own success as whether or not the housing crisis in California is getting better or getting worse. And by almost any metric, the housing crisis in California is profoundly worse today than it was 5 years ago when I started this job. And, you know, that's something that we and our leaders need to like know and be grave with, that like Californians of every income are suffering immensely from the policy choices that largely local governments are making for us. And those things do need to change still. And there's a lot more work that we need to do.
Tony, you mentioned a bunch of obstacles that rental housing providers face, and I'm wondering what you think of some of the measures that we've talked about. I mean, Louis just mentioned rental ADUs. some of these smaller rental opportunities, if I can put it that way, might not necessarily scale up to be, the kinds of solutions that cities and housing crises need. I'm wondering what you think about the opportunities for either ADUs or missing middle. Do you think that those will be enough, or will we need to see more substantial reforms?
Well, first of all, I would say that was a pretty impressive list. Like, I'm envious of the list. I'd like to have the list and have it happen here. And I think Eric would agree with that. So, there's a lot of impressive things happening in California. But what struck me the most from what Louis said was that the level of crisis is a lot worse. It's getting worse. So, in spite of all of their successes, which should be noted, the overall scope of the crisis is worsening, and I think that's certainly the case here in Ontario. And we don't have necessarily the long list of successes. So, what do I think about that, or what would I say about all that? I mean, we know that we need more housing of all types, and many of the recommendations made with respect to as of right for laneway housing, for basement suites, for garden suites, those kinds of things. Those aren't necessarily forms of housing that my members are building, but they're definitely needed, and we certainly support all those kinds of recommendations to clear the way to make those kinds of housing types easier to build and easier to provide for people. But I think the simple fact of the matter is, I mean, we within our organization, I mean, we know that governments, whether it be federal, provincial, their focus is more so on home ownership than it is on rental. I'm not saying anything that's not any great secret. I think that's certainly pretty clear, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But I think we know that for many, home ownership is simply going to be out of grasp, and Eric's working hard to make it be in grasp. But I just think that it's not going to be feasible for all people. So we need, rental has to be part of the conversation. And when I talk to some of our members who, sort of lament to me about, 5, 6, 7 year processes just to get to the development approval process, and working with the municipality, getting a project approved, and then having a resident file an appeal for what is it, $100 or $200, whatever it is, and then that adds another 3 years to the process. I mean, like, no wonder we have a crisis that's worsening all the time. So we need to be able to get some of these recommendations. John Michael, you said your headline, I'm not going to, I won't get it right, but is the Premier going to, be bold enough to take some of these recommendations and move them forward? We absolutely need that to happen. And some of the ones that I know are perhaps getting some sort of opposition from municipal leaders, and sure, maybe there have to be some tweaks before this can be, finally it can be adopted and is politically saleable. But we absolutely need to move forward, whether it be looking at the underutilized commercial properties and being able to repurpose those to include housing, whether it be, looking at obviously transit-oriented communities and getting more rental built on transit routes. These are all things that should be common sense to me, and I think make sense to a lot of people that you talk to. And we need to absolutely move forward on those so that we can ensure that we have enough housing of all types that appeal to all people, all budgets, all needs. And we clearly don't have that now. So I hope we get on with it and actually get some of these recommendations moving forward.
Nama, I had a previous panel with Leith Moore, who has his Our House concept, and his emphasis was that he's able to deliver housing without without a revolution in policy, that the policies that exist allow him to do these kinds of units. So even though this the topic of this panel is overcoming restrictive zoning, let me ask you as the resident practitioner here, is it as bad as we think? Is it, or are there opportunities without massive disruptive changes to rules to deliver that housing that is badly needed?
Great question. I believe there is for sure. That's when we came up with the Minimitries concept. We said, let's follow the rules. let's follow the rules as they are, or just instead of doing a massive mid-rise building that will take a very long time to assemble, I don't know, 6 to 8 properties. What happens if we take 1 or 2? And from an urban design perspective, it also keeps or respects the natural rhythm of our neighborhoods, right? The character of the neighborhood. So the Minimitries is an example of how we can apply the rules, play the game according to the city, what the city wants to see. And when we presented the Minimitries to the city, we actually asked it to be exempted from parking before the new parking requirements came to be, because these main streets are already so well connected to transit. So the card for zero parking was already there. And I think also we should give a lot of credit to the city that 2 or 3 years ago, you would approach the city with zero parking, anything in the neighborhood, anything that is a little bit out of the box, they would probably show you the door. And I don't know, maybe it's a new generation or a new era at City Hall, but there is this open-mindedness right now. When we come and ask for these things, they listen. So not everything, we can still talk about like why it takes so long to get buildings approved. It's the same time it takes to build them, right? That's a problem, but credit to the city for this creative mindset that is definitely present.
Eric, I want to give you sort of our last few minutes here to talk. Maybe I'll just state the obvious in terms of the political context. Nam, I believe, mentioned we've got a provincial election coming. There will be municipal elections that follow in the fall. What is the More Neighbors Toronto outlook on the politics of the coming year? Are you optimistic? I'll just volunteer. As a political observer, even if this government brings in legislation, there could be a change in government, and then we could see policy pinball back around. So, maybe why don't you give us a few closing remarks?
Yeah, for sure. So, I would say in terms of my optimism, I am much more optimistic about the provincial level of politics than I am about the municipal level of politics. I think we do have some very good leaders, municipality, especially in Toronto, but they're a minority, and the vast majority are just human impediments to change, and they will not stop being that. I think even in this next election, but I think the message that I really want our political leaders to hear, from Andrea Horwath to Steve Del Duca to Doug Ford and Steve Clark, regardless of why you got into politics, and everyone who's in politics, even at the municipal level, gets into it for a reason, right? Like they care about something enough to do it. If you do not address this crisis, like now, no matter what you want it to be remembered for, you're going to be remembered for what you didn't do to solve this crisis. Like Toronto in the GTA is looking at a future of neo-feudalism where if you do not come from a wealthy family, you will never own anything. And you have the former governor of the Bank of Canada saying, oh well, there'll be shared equity ownership options where, and even platforms from the major parties are coming in and saying now, oh yeah, we'll help take an equity stake in new housing, right? So it's a future for young people who don't have family money, having some investor who doesn't care about their family owning part of their home. It's ridiculous. We actually need to grow up and say, yeah, you know what? We recognize that we've let things get so bad that there's no painless way to end things right now. But because that housing is a fundamental, and it is so important to make sure that people are less anxious, that they're comfortable, that they feel that they can take risks to start new businesses or give back in their community, or not work so hard all the time. Like it's so foundational to quality of life that it's time for us to do the hard things and implement the reforms. And I honestly think if you look at places and where the wind is going, this new wave of attitude towards being okay with growth, like bringing back Main Street culture, it is winning elections. And I really do think that young people and a lot of people who have kids who are worried about them are honestly excited or really willing to get involved in this next election. So, don't hold back. Capitalize on the momentum and let it bring you into office, right? Like this is the time to take the risk. Also, because taking this risk is the right
Unfortunately,
thing to
Eric, I'm
do.
sorry. I do have to cut you
Right.
off there.
Sorry, that was
This
the
is all
end
the
of my
time we
rant.
have for this panel. Thank you
Thanks.
so much to all of our panelists. And if people want to log out of this session, they can join Richard Lyle for some closing remarks right now. Thank you so much, everybody.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.